Welcome to Anthrolore, catalogs and archives of myths, legends, and folklore. Well, I'm Brian.
Oh, you pointed to me.
Yeah, okay, I'm Brian. Sorry for the flub.
Oh, no.
Yeah, just I like anthropology and stories and all sorts of history.
I'm Vera. I'm an anthropology student. I study folklore and archaeology.
I'm Nalani. I study psychology and anthropology and really whatever I'm feeling at the moment. So, yeah.
I'm Eloisa. I'm just a mythology and religion nut.
I'm Lisa. I'm the one that teaches all these nuts.
Excluding me.
Excluding you. Yeah, so far. Alright. So what do we have going on today?
That's a good question. You guys have kept me in the dark for a while. I have no idea.
Well, we wanted to welcome Marsha. Marsha, pronounce your last name for us.
Monastersky.
Yeah, that's why I had you do it.
I was so close last night.
Marsha has spent so much of her life working on the reservation in terms of the Hopi Navajo land dispute. She's worked with families to provide them with some of the basic needs that they're lacking. And not to mention the fact that you're an amazing artist and a compassionate human being, and I'm just excited to have you here to kind of share your experience and your story with us, Marsha. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. So as she said, my name is Marsha Monastersky. I first came to the Reds after a journey hitchhiking around the country. So I presented last night to a poetry reading, so I'm going to start with that. So it explains a little bit of how I came to be where I am. So the two poems that I presented last night come from two different points in my discovery of what it means to find home. The first poem was written many years ago when I returned to the East Coast after a 3-year journey on the road hitchhiking around the United States. I traveled without money, without even a sleeping bag, not knowing where I would sleep at night or where I would be heading tomorrow. It did not matter which direction I chose. It was beautiful in every direction. I did not seek anything in particular. The journey was an end, not a means. When you have total freedom and no possessions, everywhere becomes your home. If I was searching for a home, it was not to find a physical place, but my relationship with the universe. The journey was not to find the next exit on the highway, but to find my place in creation. The original text of the poem Storage Chest of Elders was lost long ago, but I reconstructed its essence and submitted to CCC's Common Book about Belonging. The first poem is entitled Storage Chest of Elders. Storage chest of elders, worlds of thought through time. Time, my companion, places his hand on mine. Together we ride the crest of a tide. We find eternity. The storage chest is open. The elders all agree, traversing intergalactic universes they never told us of. Time, my companion, knows no limitations. Eternity our guide. We cannot turn back. We fly. After I returned to the East Coast, I continued to feel a spiritual connection to the land and the people that I met in Hopi and Navajo lands. I remained back east for a few years, but something was missing. I might not have understood it at the time, but this was not my home. I was invited by the Diné elders to come to Dinétah, Navajo land, and help in their fight against forced relocation by the U.S. government and environmental degradation from Peabody Coal Company. I lived there for the next 25 years and grew in both my relationship with the land and the people. Through my work in defense of the land and people, I learned something else about finding home, that when we are claimed by the land or choose our home, we must accept the responsibility to protect it. The elders talked about the critical time we are in now and how the choices we will make affect the outcome of what happens to our Mother the Earth. We must choose and act before it is too late. The next poem talks about our responsibility to honor this relationship with our home. The poem is entitled Worlds Within Worlds. Worlds within worlds. Time. Do you know what time it is? It's later than you think. Death and life. What separates the two? Decay and birth. Do they both not give life? Earth. Our mother is crying. Destruction. The people are destroyers. Prophecy. The indigenous peoples teach. Listen. No one hears. Aliens. Us or them. Intervention. Purification or destruction. Choice. The people must choose. Intervention. See. Worlds within worlds. But the Natal is not the last home I would come to know. I moved to Flagstaff to attend CCC 3 years ago and became part of a community here. And the relationships I've built here with faculty and fellow students have supported and nurtured us and enabled us to succeed and learned how to believe in ourselves and in each other. I thank Lisa and I thank CCC for welcoming us home. So I first went out to Hopi and Navajo lands in the early 1970s. And when I was hitchhiking around the country, and I traveled with my identical mirror twin sister, and sometimes we were together, sometimes I was alone. And I found home everywhere. And I learned how to see people. I learned how to listen. And I discovered magical lands that drew me back. And in 1992, I packed up my computer after working in Yellowstone on wolf reintroduction to help the Navajo people fight forced relocation by the U.S. government. And for the next 25 years, as I said, I lived in hogans, traditional homes. I lived in substandard trailers, one-room houses. And I lived like the people I worked with, impoverished, financially, not in any other way. The people that I work with are beautiful. I've had the incredible opportunity to sweat with grandmothers that are amazing, and most of them no longer here. People like Alice Benally and Roberta Blackgoat and Catherine Smith and many of the grandmothers that I still have as my relations. And those memories are amazing. They taught me strength beyond what I ever imagined. And I had to be strong because the grandmothers put me out on the front lines. And I said, don't do that. But they did. And we didn't have a road map to go where we needed to go, so we created a road. And the U.S. government targeted the Navajo people who were innocent and guilty of nothing other than being born where they were born and their ancestors were born before them. But there was a monster by the name of Peabody Coal Company, and that was our first target. Because if the coal mine goes, relocation stops. But it was hard. The people that were living in the mining area, like Maxine Cascoli, would wake up in the middle of the night and her dishes would rattle on her shelves because Peabody blasted any time of day or night. And the people faced relocation, some of them just by Peabody Coal Company, some of them by the United States government and Peabody Coal Company. And they were targeted so their lands could be mined, because sacred lands often have sacred resources. So that's what the people call it, whether it's uranium or coal or gas or oil. But the U.S. government and the corporations look at it like things to make money off of. So we began filing citizens' complaints, which was the way people living in a mining area complain about mining violations. The first thing to go was nighttime blasting, and they were only allowed to blast from sunrise to sunset. and they weren't allowed to do what they call cannonballs, which is when you overshoot the holes, and just to see the blaze go up. And then we filed a lawsuit against Peabody Coal Company, and we were going to go to court. And we had 4 days' notice. And I wrote the appeal that got us to court. And I said to the grandmothers, well, now what do? We need an attorney. Well, you're going to go. They wouldn't give us an extension of time to get an attorney. So I presented as lay counsel in Donnell Lyons versus Peabody Coal Company. And the lawsuit lasted 5 days, 4 nights in Flagstaff. I'd never, and we won. It was documented as the first time national corporation in the U.S. court. And it was the strength of the grandmothers and sheep wool in my right hand that got us through. And then Peabody, together with the Navajo Hopi tribes, filed an appeal. So we had to continue fighting Peabody for many years. And happily, just recently, after numerous lawsuits and mediation, Peabody shut their doors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we won. And yesterday, the last load of coal was fired at the Navajo generating station that burned Peabody coal. So today's a good day to start about Peabody.
Right.
People would say, Doda Peabody. No Peabody. They caused silicosis, black lung, respiratory problems, trauma, because Peabody officials would come using the Navajo Nation government officials who served the U.S. government and mining interests to knock on the door of the grandmothers to threaten them till they would relocate. They would desecrate their burial sites and sacred sites, and they didn't care. So along the way we said, well, how are we going to stop the relocation? There's lots of details I could go into about how the people were swindled and how they were thrown off their land. And we kept trying because the people wouldn't give up. This is their life. And they're the caretakers of the land. And for them to leave the land, they said, made them feel like leaves blowing in the wind or trees without roots. They couldn't practice their religion anywhere else because it's land-based and site-specific. So they said if they were to relocate from those lands beyond the 4 sacred mountains that the holy people told them to live within, the holy people wouldn't know where they were anymore. And the people continued fighting, no matter what. Ragtag, no money. We went to Congress and beat down the walls of Congress to meet with anyone that would listen with us. There was a time when there was a grandmother who was our CEO, Roberta Blackout, and we were in Congress and they said she couldn't walk and needed a wheelchair because the walls of Congress are really big and long and on sacred marble floors, which the people don't understand how something made so sacred is so devastating to the people. And they said to Roberta Blackout, well, if you wait an hour, we'll get you a wheelchair. And she said, I don't have a minute to wait. So we booked back-to-back appointments with members of Congress. And we'd hear about how Navajo governmental officials began by Peabody Coal Company and the U.S. government and the Department of the Interior would go around before the grandmothers and say, don't listen to them, they're lying. They didn't know how to lie. Most of them never went to school. They never grew up in a culture where they would even think about what lying constituted. And we went to Congress and we met with the people and we said, listen, but they wouldn't listen. And then McCain, who people say is wonderful, is guilty of genocide, was guilty of genocide. He passed various legislations And I'll give you a little history. The U.S. government Department of the Interior was a major shareholder in the Navajo Generating Station. The U.S. government Department of the Interior, under the Office of Surface Mining, was the regulator and enforcer for mining regulations, which is sort of like wearing two hats on one head, because you don't enforce regulations for something that you're profiting from on the other hand. And McCain passed legislation, one of them called the Final Solution, which is what Hitler used. It said that Hitler looked at the relocation of the Navajo people as the model for what he did for the Jewish people. And it is genocide. According to the Genocide Convention, genocide is anything done to intentionally harm a group of people. And that's what they did.
Mhm.
They say there was 10, 12,000 people that relocated. It was 12,000 families, extended families, because the elder head of household was the only one that was counted. So it was like taking a bomb and letting it off in the traditional ancestral lands these people lived in because of a manufactured land dispute, where they said the Hopi and the Navajo were fighting each other. They weren't fighting each other. The U.S. government had an interest in clearing the land and determining the title so Peabody Coal Company could come in and mine. And they laid waste to the people. And there's still people living there. And those are the ones I work with. And there was a grandmother, Mabel Benally, and she told me, promise, you'll never give up fighting. Never, 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 never stop fighting Peabody. And it's kind of hard to make that promise, but we won. And it was a lot of people's work. But that genocide is real. In the 40s, they did uranium mining in the southern portion of the Navajo Nation. The U.S. government was the only sole purchaser of the uranium with no requirement for cleanup. When the United States government decided they didn't want the uranium anymore, shovels were left in the ground. Papers were left in desks. I know, because I saw it. And for 50 years, the government knew, all the governments, the U.S. government, the Navajo Nation government, they knew the water was contaminated that the people were drinking. They never told them. So I figured at some point I'm going to work on uranium. And I was told the water was contaminated, and I was going to an environmental justice conference. So environmental justice was created in Executive Order 12898 by President Clinton. And the intention was to stop the disproportionate impact that people of color, and Native people have experienced. And we went to Washington, D.C., and it was passed on February 11th, 1994. Right after that, we were in Washington, D.C., and we filed the first case of environmental justice. And that became a tool in our tool chest. We've got to have a way to be heard, to get a seat at the table, because if you don't have a seat at the table, you don't have anything. So, ironically, the people that were here first are the ones that serve in the Army the most. They're the ones that died as a result of coal mining impacts, where they struggled and gasped to get a breath, relying on oxygen tanks because they had black lung, or they die of a variety of cancers from uranium mining. So I was in a meeting we were hosting in Black Falls in the southern portion of the Navajo Nation, and I put up some signs about uranium contamination of the wells there. And a woman who is one of my heroes, Rolanda Tahani, came over to me and said, I lived there. I drink that water. I always drink that water. My neighbors, my relatives all drink that water. She started making a list of all the people drinking the water. And I said, well, I got to do something. Because she asked me, what are you going to do now that you know? So when I was in Washington, D.C., I was accompanied by a dear colleague of mine who was the first special assistant for environmental justice, Robert Faithful. I met him the first week he had his job before it was even publicly announced. It was on the day of a solar eclipse. And we walked and we talked. And he understood what it meant for the people to suffer. And when the Environmental Justice Executive Order was created, it reflected the needs of people who never had a voice. So he was there with me at this conference. And I said, so what's going on in Black Falls and Grand Falls and Box Springs where people are drinking contaminated water? Before I even came back from Washington, D.C., 2 days after I presented at this conference with Billy Reese Key, who was our CEO at that time, the signs were posted on all the wells. People were still suffering and the wells were still working, and if they didn't have a vehicle that was running well, they were still drinking the water. The only problem was now they knew it was contaminated. So we had to do more than that. And a dear colleague of mine, Kathy Helms, wrote endless articles in the newspaper. So they were published almost every day. Crisis in Box Springs, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. And we kept the pressure on. There was a uranium upgrader mine and mill that a friend of mine told me was there. And I went. It looked like Mars. Never cleaned up. Right across the banks from the Black Falls, where people were dying of brain cancer, stomach cancer, pancreatic cancer, all sorts of cancer, leukemia, depended on where they were. And eventually, a year later, of full-time efforts by all of us, the Navajo Nation passed an historic declaration of public health emergency to do something to help the people. And the Navajo Nation says, you know, you opened up a can of worms. It's a can that needed to be opened.
Yes.
I brought the uranium mine and mill to US EPA and Superfund in Region 9 in San Francisco. And eventually investigator came out from Superfund. You can watch Sacred Poison, it's on YouTube. And he said, oh, it's not a big problem. But turns out it's the most contaminated place there is on the Navajo Nation. Maxed out my Geiger counter, maxed out the US EPA Superfund Geiger counter, maxed out a Geiger counter from the University of Michigan that a BBC reporter used, and maxed out everybody's Geiger counter because it was enriched uranium that they made there and experimental. And it's still not cleaned up. The only thing they did was post signs to say it was contaminated. Whole generations of people died and suffered. There's a family in Blue Gap, dear, dear, dear people. All their children, most of their children died of what was later called Navajo neuropathy. What is that? She was told by the doctors, maybe you did something you shouldn't have done. And these are traditional people to cause that to happen. And there were some other families that had children dying. It's a muscle wasting disease that would start at the feet and go up the body to their vital organs until it killed them. And they finally gave it the term Navajo neuropathy because it only happened on Navajo. And I still see these people. And she still talks about the pain when she takes out her children's pictures. They were out sheep herding and drank some of the water there, and it killed them. So depending on the area. Why does this happen? Because the United States government doesn't care. The first people who should have most rights of anyone, the most clean water of anyone, suffers the most. And they can cry, they can yell in the dark, they can yell in the light, but who listens? But they have a strength that I am amazed at. The U.S. government created the tribal governments. It was part of the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA. Failed policies just to get mineral resources. So in the beginning of the creation of the tribal council, the only thing that they could do was sign mineral leases in the presence of a representative of the Department of the Interior. Because that's why they were created. The first lease, the United States government knew there was coal, and along with Salt River Project is a major shareholder of the Navajo Generating Station, which really doesn't do anything for Navajo. And they said, oh, over there, that's where the coal is, because they knew. But they had to have a way to get to the coal. So the genocide began in Black Mesa. And Congress, they said, oh, there's a range war going on between the Navajo and the Hopi. So they looked to Goldwater and McCain. What's going on? They're fighting each other. Because they were in the pockets of the corporations. Mm-hmm. And without bothering to find out what was going on, they laid waste to Black Mesa. And bulldozed and desecrated thousands of burial sites. Ancient Anasazi, which in Navajo you say Nihisaza, because they're not the ancient enemy, the ancient people. And we kept fighting and we kept fighting, and we said, okay, one day we had medicine people, Hatafli, that were in Washington, D.C., and said, Congress is not going to help us. So we said, what do we do? And we sat there. It's part of the folk law of a place called Storm Mountain near Tusto in the southern portion of the Navajo Nation. We were all sitting in a circle, and there was a notebook open, a spiral-bound notebook. And my twin sister was there because she would help us with the appointments. And she wrote in a big circle, your voice will be heard, and put a circle around it. And there was an inchworm that came from the side of the notebook over the binder, right in the middle of the circle, where it says your voice will be heard. We went to the United Nations. We left Congress. So we went to Congress, we went to the United Nations, and I was with a wonderful dear friend of mine, Bonnie Whitesinger, and her mother was Pauline Whitesinger. And these people are very famous if you look them up. And Pauline Whitesinger is known for her quote, to relocate is to disappear and never be seen again. Her daughter was with me in New York, and the chief of the Human Rights Caucus, the chief of the Human Rights Office at the United Nations, Elsa Stampapapalou, was my teacher and my mentor. And she says, do this. I said to her, well, how do we penetrate the United Nations? They're the biggest bureaucracy in the world. And she said, I'll show you how. You have to file a 1503 formal complaint procedure because you got to move their mechanisms. Okay. You done? No, I wasn't done yet. So the last day that the Human Rights Committee was at the United Nations, before they went back to Geneva, Bonnie Whitesinger and I presented a complaint. And then we lobbied all the NGOs, the faith-based non-governmental organizations at the United Nations, and we said, well, we got to do this. We got to get an investigation. And many trips to New York then, back and forth for the people. John Benally, Roberta Blackwell, Catherine Smith, medicine people, Avery Denny, many, many times. Many, many people. I don't even know how we ever afforded these trips, but somehow we did it. Sometimes we jumped on planes at the last minute and our luggage went somewhere else, but we did it. And there was a conference that I had been attending. There's the various entities within the United Nations. There's a Commission on Human Rights. There's a Commission on Sustainable Development. So at this point, this was the Commission on Sustainable Development. And within 2 weeks of being there, I was elected to be the co-chair of the NGO Human Rights Caucus at the United Nations. And my colleague, Goodluck Debo, who is a colleague of Ken Saro-Wiwa from Ogoni in Nigeria, was my co-chair. And we would say, United States and Nigeria, human rights violations side by side. So what can you do? You embarrass them. We were founding members of a NGO, International People's Tribunal on Human Rights and the Environment. And Ogoni land, which was desecrated by Shell Oil, was named as a perpetrator. Peabody Coal Company was named as a perpetrator. The Innu people from Canada came, so we had our tribunals across the street from the United Nations. And we kept pushing, and we kept pushing. And then we became the first investigation by the United Nations of the United States in history. And the only site visit that the human rights investigator visited for indigenous lands in the United States. And we had a medicine man, Avery Denny, who had been to New York, who was presenting about traditional religion. So many of the ways I know how to talk about all these years and what we did, I'd sometimes say, what good are we doing? And then I'd hear from the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission that our lobbying trips to Geneva and New York were responsible for Article 10 in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, opposing forced relocation of indigenous peoples worldwide. So sometimes it's like putting a pebble in the water and you get ripples that go around it. You know, the words that the people had were remembered. If you go to the High Commissioner for Human Rights and you look up the right to water, you come up with what we submitted on the right to water. And water is sacred, because if you're using water in a ceremony, what happens to that water if it's contaminated? You know, I'd recommend you also watch Sacred Poison in Austin So is a Toffley, a medicine man that was in it, and he's putting his cups under, his hands cupped under a hose with water coming out, and he says, I use this water for ceremonies. What happens to that person when the water I'm blessing them with and they're drinking and using in the ceremony is contaminated? Norris Nez, who is my Che, my father, and taught me, affected my brain. Hatafli, we went to Geneva together, we went to New York together, we went to California together. He called me the woman he traveled around the world with. He said, when the water is and the land are desecrated, where you have ceremonies, that those ceremonies then are negated because they're polluted. So what these corporations have done on these sacred land with these valuable sacred resources is not only to contaminate the water and contaminate the land, but contaminate the effect of the prayers that the people live by and are strong. And what the people have that the United States government and Peabody never imagined was the strength to fight no matter what. If it was their last breath, it was there. They had to, because that's why they were here. That's why the holy people put them on this earth. And I remember there was a meeting It was an agreement that was being pushed at that time. And there was a meeting at Rocky Ridge School. And there was a Judge McHugh came from Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco. And we had posters all over the gym. And we defeated it, 250 to 1.
Wow.
And the people were all excited. We won! And then somewhere out of the ashes of the accommodation agreement, as called, was an agreement in principle that people never saw, including the woman, Catherine Smith, that was the spokesperson for the people. And she said, I didn't sign my name on this. My name was forged, like a lot of the signatures were. So I said, okay. We went to a meeting with Judge McHugh in San Francisco. And I sat next to Catherine Smith, across from Judge McHugh, and she handed him an notarized affidavit saying her signature was forged. We went to Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and we told them, we want to see your proof of that vote on that agreement you say was signed and voted on by the people. And they said, okay, we'll fill out a Freedom of Information Act request. I said, okay. So I hand wrote an Freedom of Information Act request that we gave to Department of Justice. And then in the mail came a letter. They have a complete record of the agreement of principle that the people killed, but the only thing they had for the agreement in principle, that the AIP that they called it, was a blank ratification form, because there was never a vote taken. So what happened is, over the years, the people would try to have their voice heard, but without money for lawyers. You know, sometimes we get pro bono attorneys. Sometimes I'd step over the edge. You know, I became a paralegal because I decided I liked the law. But Indian law, they call a canary in a coal mine, because they put a canary down into a coal mine to see if it'll die, to see if there's any oxygen in there. And that's what Indian law is. Jim Zion, who I worked with for years, was Attorney General for the Navajo Nation, and then he became the People's Attorney. And he would say anything is possible in Indian law, just like a cartoon. It doesn't make sense. There's no rhyme or reason for what it is that they do, except for what they want to pursue from the people. So, you know, you say that the number 666 is the sign of the devil, right? At least some people say. Well, interestingly, Peabody signed their first lease with the tribes on 6/6/66. And 6 weeks later, a Commissioner Bennett in Washington, D.C., in the Department of the Interior, imposed a Bennett freeze, which he claimed was a temporary solution to a manufactured land dispute, but they called it real. It lasted for 43 years on the books. It denied people the right to build houses, fix their homes, even if there was a hole in the roof or windows were broken. Denied them water infrastructure, denied them roads. They had Black Ops helicopters that would fly overhead and do surveillance. If somebody tried to build an outhouse for basic sanitation, because these people water, no electricity, barely roads that'll function, they would get cited, or they had to take down what they built. So they'd have to put one log at a time, wait a week, put another log if they were making a corral, try to see a way that they could survive. But what all these governments never counted on, that the people were so rooted, like a tree, into their land, like an ancient tree, that no matter what, they would never give up. And this went on, and we filed suit on the Bennett freeze. And we had a case go to the Navajo Supreme Court for a special sitting in Tuba City to say, okay, you're saying this is a compact. What they tried to do was to seal it so that the people would never know what it was. So I went with the medicine man, met with the chapter president there, and she gave me a copy of the compact, the Bennett Freeze Intergovernmental Compact. They called it the Navajo Hopi Intergovernmental Compact. and make copies and handed it out like candy. Because that's what you got to do when they try to make something secret. What we didn't know at the time when we were filing suit is that they were intending to prevent people from suing on anything connected to the Navajo Hopi land dispute. If somebody's animals were confiscated, as they often were for a period of many, many years, or their house was bulldozed, or anything happened, they had no redress whatsoever. Because the U.S. government paid 100% to fund the Hopi Rangers, who often weren't Hopi, but they worked for a salary and they confiscated people's livestock, their sheep, their goats, their horses, their donkeys, their cattle, and try to wipe them out. And we'd have to fight to get them back. And illegal confiscations, they didn't give a 5-day notice that they were required to, got them back. One time, in the early days, our hero attorney who helped on the Peabody suit, Mick Harrison, these are all real people, they all have names, taught me 101 in getting animals back. We were able to prove that everything that they confiscated on that day was without any notice, including 100 donkeys in Cactus Valley. And I was with a woman from Cactus Valley one time, and the donkeys came up to me and they're neighing, and I said, "Look at that." And she said, "They're saying thank you because they're alive." You know, and then after that, there were people who had horses, donkeys, goats, sheep, run. They'd chase the sheepdogs, sometimes killing them just to get to the animals. Mm-hmm. People were under siege. A grandmother, Anna H. Begay, she had donkeys and horses confiscated. And we were trying to raise money to get them out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs impoundment yard. We missed the deadline. And they went to an auction house, Sun Valley in Holbrook. So she went to the city, to Western Union, to get the money out, and got to I-40 to go to Holbrook, and it was a sandstorm. So this highway was closed. So I was able to call the auction house and speak to the wife of the owner, and we bid the amount of money that we had reserved to get her horses and her donkeys, and she brought them home. There's so many stories that I could tell you. They finally came home. It was the eve of Passover, which is a Jewish holiday to celebrate freedom. I never put anything religious on the Big Mountain list, but I couldn't resist. It was so intense. I got a phone call from Hawaii from a person that got an income tax refund. He says, "I was trying to figure out what to do with the income tax refund." And at that time, we were getting ready to go to the United Nations in Geneva because there was a report coming out on the UN investigation of the United States, and we had 8 people going to Geneva. And that helped us find lodging when we were in Geneva. And some of us went to Germany and met with the German Parliament and the European Parliament. And we have a European Parliament letter of support, resolution of support. We had deadline dates in 2000, February 1st, when U.S. Marshals were going to forcibly evict the people at gunpoint, and we mobilized internationally and renewed some of those acquaintances when we went overseas. And that attorney, Mick Harrison, was out there for 2 weeks during deadline date in case anything happened. We had international delegation of people from Italy and Sweden and Germany, and they came from all over. We had supporters. And they went to all the people's homes all throughout the region. Black Ops helicopters again were flying overhead to see. We don't know how many people are out there. We didn't know how many people were out there. There were some human rights observers that came from Germany, and they tried to meet with the Hopi tribe to say, "Hey, let's be all peaceful." Mm-hmm. Then the Hopi tribe, this is the government, not the people, called human rights observers the worst people in the world. So we managed to get past that deadline because the U.S. Marshals didn't come in. We were so mobilized. And sometimes I'd say to Pauline Whitesinger, well, you know, we keep trying. And she said, we've won because we're still here.
Yes.
So deadline after deadline would come. The people are still there.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 2007, President Obama lifted the Bennett freeze. Only thing is nobody mentioned the area was devastated and there was no money connected to it. But by statute, Congress had given $60 million plus interest. We filed an accounting suit to find the money.
Mm-hmm.
We thought, oh, there's going to be hammers flying, houses built. People are going to finally be able to have a good life. And nothing happened. So we reached out to college students. A lot of them were in California. Project Pueblo. Wonderful. 2 brothers from Bangladesh started it. Sean and Ryan. And we'd have kids come out and spend a week on spring break, winter break, in the cold. They never complained. Water systems for people. We fixed roofs. We fixed houses. We built houses. We reached out to faith-based organizations. Come, help us build. The only hammers flying were the ones that we were putting up in the air. Mm-hmm. And little by little, home by home, we were able to give people some hope. And currently, we're working on a home for John Benally, who has always been in the front line of the resistance against relocation and always put himself last. Oh, that person needs it more than me. That person needs it more than me. And we wrote a grant and got some funding, went into cost overrun, as things usually do. And we're fixing a house for him. So when I'm not in Flagstaff, I'm there. And it's a beautiful home. We have people coming with supply runs from California, Operation 2911. We had a church, Mesa Grande Academy in Southern California. We've had kids from Virginia Tech, from Harvard, from all over the country at different times. Over 1,000 kids that would come out and help us.
Maybe we can talk to you about getting ourselves in the anthropology club involved in that.
I would hope so. So you camp out,
Mm-hmm.
bring your water, your good water.
And have some of you love camping. Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things we learned with having kids was the formula for success. You work hard and have a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes we'd have bonfires, or kids would learn how to make jewelry that they could bring home, or bring their ingredients for s'mores or whatever they wanted, and mutton fests, you know, when people would butcher a sheep, and somebody who's studying pre-med, I can help with that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's another world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like this world. It's my preferred world. This isn't my home. I read and talked to you about home, but what makes my heart happy is when I leave the pavement and I'm on the dirt roads. Because this world, it doesn't really make sense. You look at money as a measurement of success, but the measurement of success, I believe, as I get older, is the memories we create. Because in the end, that's what is the richest thing of all. And I don't have any money, but I'm rich. Because I think about all the things. I think about Austin So and Alice So and Rolanda Tahani and John Benally and Rena Babbitt Lane, who's my adopted mother, who I was brought into their family through folk law as well. So folk law is usually based on reality and truth. It has to be told, if it's oral, so that it remains from generation to generation. Just like the people that are living there have an oral tradition, because most of them, the elders, don't read, write, or speak English. So what I want to give you is a message of hope. Because it's not the amount of suffering that they've endured, it's how they could be strong enough, no matter what, to always have hope, to always be able to have a sense of humor and to laugh and to love. Because that's what makes us succeed and continue. Beautiful. Thank you.